Hello, everyone, and welcome to UC Berkeley's Osher Lifelong Learning Institute Speaker Series, which occurs throughout the year, offering new insights about the most urgent issues of the day. And could there be a more urgent issue than Ukraine? I'm Susan Hoffman, Berkeley's Assistant Dean of Lifelong Learning and the Director of OLLI at Berkeley. In addition to the speaker series, Ali offers courses, travel, field trips, and volunteer opportunities in a public space that includes campus students, faculty, staff, and we create a whole learning community. Today's talk is with two Berkeley colleagues who were with us 4 years ago, 2 days after Russia invaded Ukraine. George Breslauer and Yuriy Gorodnichenko and myself talked about what had just happened and our deepest fears. Um, George is a Berkeley professor emeritus of political science and the author of and editor of 14 books on Soviet, Russian, and communist politics and foreign relations. He is also our former provost at Berkeley. Yuriy Gorodnichenko, a native of Ukraine, is the Quantedge presidential professor in Berkeley's Department of Economics. Um, One of the things that Yuri will share with us today is that he is a leader in what's called the Center for Economic Policy Research, which has produced between 700 and 800 pieces of research on the Ukraine initiative as a part of the research and perspective. I want to say before we hear from Yuri and George, just a few things. I want to encourage people, if you have not seen the video of our talk 4 years ago, I encourage you to do that. I think the comparative of where we are, where we were then and where we are now, is important for us to understand the arc of history, certainly. The casualties of this war are hard to overestimate. It has been the biggest conflict um, in Europe since World War II. The costs have been on the Ukrainian side, more than 13,000 Ukrainians have lost their lives. The effect on the infrastructure of that country has been enormous. They have been the breadbasket for Europe. 7 million Ukrainians out of a country that's roughly 37 million. 7 million Ukrainians have left the country. 41 countries have come to the aid of Ukraine to the tune of $380 billion. Russia, on the other hand, is 4 times the size of Ukraine and has lost over 1 million people, 1 million soldiers, we might say. And the countries that have come to Russia's aid have included or are restricted to Iran and North Korea. Despite all of this, the resilience of the Ukrainian people has just been amazing. And what I'd like to do is as today, as we talk about what has happened over the last 4 years, Yuri, if you would start with giving us a sense around how the Ukrainian people are feeling today, and certainly about any thoughts about what is likely to be next, if there is any credibility to this deadline of June that the Trump administration has called for. Can you get us started?
Yes, yes, and thank you for organizing this again. I also want to encourage everybody to rewatch that video I did just before this call to make sure I remember what George and I said then and where we agreed or disagreed. Look, the situation in Ukraine is very difficult. It's not only 7 million refugees, people who left the country. We also have more than 4 million of internally displaced persons. again, it's just as a point of reference, roughly 300,000 Ukrainians are in the US now as refugees. So it's a very big number. We should also understand that the scale of damages is enormous. We have more than 13,000 missile attacks since the beginning of the war, more than 140,000 drone attacks. If you look at media reports, this is something that is confirmed by witnesses, journalists, and so on. We had more than 500,000 strikes since the beginning of the war, and this is not just drones and missiles. This is also artillery shelling and so on. So the damages are huge. With the fog of war, it's hard to know the precise number. We have a range of estimates. But I would say the consensus view on the lower bound of where we are in terms of losses for Ukraine, we're looking at something like $500 billion at this point. That's the lower bound. I think the more reasonable estimate, kind of the point estimate, my preferred estimate is something like $1 trillion cumulatively over 4 years. So that's a huge number, an astounding number. Every day of the war is going to cost us roughly $1 billion. So every day is very expensive. And this is just an economic cost. I'm not talking about suffering, psychological trauma, and so on. So the situation is obviously very, very difficult, and the recent attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure make life even more difficult. I have family in Kyiv, and it's hard to describe to people who live in California what it means to have minus 30 Celsius and have no heating for a long period of time, multiple days, when you don't have electricity for a long time. Maybe electricity is a little easier because we had blackouts, but imagine you have 2 hours of electricity for a month, right? So 2 hours of electricity per day for a month. So it's very hard to live in this kind of conditions. But having said this, when you look at polls, how Ukrainians feel about this, do they want to surrender to Russian demands at this point? Are they willing to give up the Donbass or anything like this? The vast majority of Ukrainians continue to basically reject most of the Russian demands. So we don't give up the Donbass. We are not willing to make any restrictions on the Ukrainian armed forces. We are not willing to give up any sovereignty. And this is really amazing that despite these very difficult conditions, people continue to hold up so strongly. So there is, an idea that somehow the war is going to end soon because of the pressure from Trump. I'm very skeptical that anything like this is going to happen. What Russia wants from Ukraine is basically a surrender. This is unacceptable. Zelensky said just yesterday, if we don't sign a deal with Russia on Trump, supported by Trump, so be it. We would be better off without a deal than with having a terrible deal. And if Ukraine were just totally dependent on the U.S., it would be very difficult. But now with so much help coming from Europe, I think Ukraine has a financial lifeline, a military lifeline from Europe, and so it will have resources to continue the fight, continue its defense. I don't expect anything from the current negotiations. They are not genuine. Putin is not interested in peace. And this war, I predict, is going to continue for quite some time.
That certainly has been, that was our speculation 4 years ago, that this would be a long war. And I think others as well. I think that, George, could you talk about how could Russia endure such losses in the military and financially, economically?
Well, there seems to be quite a bit of disagreement among economists about the current state and prospective state of the Russian economy. Putin has basically turned the country into a war economy. He has found ways to induce large-scale conscription from principally from the hinterlands. He's tried to avoid large-scale conscription within Moscow and St. Petersburg because he knows that as sort of centers of the country, that's where you've got the more educated young people who are more likely to resist the idea of sacrificing their lives in Ukraine. Um, uh, so I think in Putin's imagination, this is a rerun of World War II in a sense. We will pay any price in order to prevail. And indeed, they're paying a huge price. Um, and it's basically transited to a war economy. And Putin is willing to pay any price.
And Yuri, in your center for economic policy research, what does that say? At what point is there any collapse of the Russian economy?
I think we had an opportunity to bring Russia, down early in the war, but unfortunately, sanctions were not big enough, not enforced strongly enough, and so we created lots and lots of opportunities for the Russian economy to evade sanctions and escape some of the most, difficult elements of those sanctions. But having said this, the sanctions are wearing out the Russian economy. When you look at sources of economic growth in Russia, economists typically emphasize three main sources. One is labor, another one is capital, and the third one is productivity gains. None of these sources in Russia is looking good, right? So we see that the Russian population is decreasing. They lose a lot of people in Ukraine. Many people left the country. So it's hard to imagine that labor force is going to contribute to rapid growth in Russia in any shape and form. Capital, same idea. Russia lost access to global financial markets. There is very little FDI, foreign direct investment into Russia. So there, again, very little prospect of growth coming from capital. Same with productivity gains. Russia relied a lot on Western technology. It's not flowing into Russia anymore. In the current economy, where, as George said, war economy, it's hard to imagine innovation from any civilian sector on an important macroeconomic scale. So the Russian economy is going to stagnate, and it will stagnate more going forward, just because it's its resources, its savings, its wealth. In the beginning of the war, Russia had big reserves, but these reserves are being depleted, and we can see that the Kremlin is struggling with financing this war. They start to raise taxes, something that was unthinkable even some years ago. But now it is a reality for many Russian businesses that they have to pay higher taxes. The cost of inputs is going up. So in many ways, this is going to be a death by 1,000 cuts, and it will be hard to tell which of those cuts is going to be fatal for the Russian economy. And just to paraphrase, maybe Ernst Hemingway, who said bankruptcy has kind of two stages. It kind of starts and goes very slowly, but then it ends very, very quickly. So we don't know an exact time when the Russian economy is going to collapse, but everybody predicts stagnation and decline. And again, to emphasize George's point, you see a boom in the military-industrial complex in Russia, but the civilian sector has not grown since the beginning of the war. If anything, it contracted. So this is telling me that the Russian economy is running out of steam, and it will face some very serious challenges going forward.
George, do you want to comment?
No, I think Yuri has said it well, and I think that the question, I suppose, is since it's hard to imagine the total collapse of the Russian economy, what that would look like. The question is at what point in those 1,000 cuts there are political reverberations that lead to a loosening of the Russian negotiating terms. One could imagine, that if Putin stayed in power and stayed alive, over time, that he would just dig in. his personality has always been one that once engaged in a physical conflict, whether it was interpersonal on the streets of Leningrad back when he was a kid, or more recently in international relations, he will not back down, and he will not stop until he has prevailed. And if that is a personality trait, it suggests that no matter the pain that the Russian economy civilian economy is experiencing, he probably will not let that influence his willingness to, say, give back the eastern provinces of Ukraine, or other things that right now he is defined as unimaginable. Um, if Putin were to die or be overthrown in a palace coup, which I view as quite unlikely, but death is unpredictable, you might see his successors saying, now is the time we've got to rethink this. When Stalin died, his successors rethought their international posture. When Khrushchev was overthrown, the Brezhnev regime rethought their international posture, and so on. It's gone steadily like that with each successive regime in power, but it often takes a period of stagnation before the exit of the leader. Um, uh, before you then get a by the leader's successors. So I don't have much hope that Putin's going to loosen his terms markedly, but perhaps his successors would if that comes to pass.
And George and Yuri, is there any, this is not a question I asked you to think about, but what about the intelligence agencies, both in Europe, the United States, and with the KGB? Um, any kind of indication that there's any level of communication? Is there a back channel? Is there anything that exists that can be talked about? Okay.
Well, on the economic front, I can tell you that CIA did not predict the collapse of the Soviet Union. It was a massive failure. Many European intelligence agencies did not predict that Russia is going to invade Ukraine. So I'm kind of skeptical on their capabilities to give anything above and beyond what we already know roughly. And I agree with George that the fundamentals of this war are such that they are not going to change anytime soon unless Putin dies or something dramatic happens in Russia. And because those kind of events are unpredictable, I don't think they have a comparative advantage relative to what we have. So even if there is a back channel, maybe there is some communication, but in the big scheme of things, it changes nothing.
I agree. I agree. Not that I have any insider knowledge. First thing that came to my mind was to say, uh, I don't know, and if I told you, I'd have to kill you. So,
Yeah. With um, looking at some of the chat questions that are coming in. So, what is different from 4 years ago is that Trump is now president again. And I think, and himself having a sense of a new world order. How is that likely to play out as well?
um, I'll start on that one. Trump, like Putin and like Xi Jinping, has a sphere of influence mentality about their neighborhoods. And that's why, other than when dealing with Hamas and with Iran, Trump has targeted mostly the Western Hemisphere, whether it's making demands for Greenland or talking about Canada, or Canada as a 51st state, or getting back the Panama Canal, or renaming the Gulf of Mexico, or going into Venezuela and taking their leader. Uh, he has a conception of world order based upon his having domination in the Western Hemisphere. Uh, that that conception, of course, should make a lot of people very nervous. Um, Europeans should be nervous that he will not sustain the American the American commitment to both prosperity and physical security in in Europe at large. The Taiwanese ought to be very nervous if he legitimizes the idea that world order should be based upon spheres of influence deferred to by the major powers. Then Ukraine and Taiwan would be left to their own devices in that conception. If Trump is in a situation on the ground, actually, where he's going to be accused of having lost Taiwan or lost Ukraine, he might then overcome that singular focus on the Western Hemisphere because he wouldn't want to be blamed for the loss. But that's his mercurial side. But if we're looking just at the conception of world order, the spheres of influence approach is very different from everything that has gone before in the post-World War II era.
I would add to this that Trump is extremely counterproductive for reaching peace in Ukraine. He basically gives Putin a hope that some kind of deal may be cut at the expense of Ukraine, and all you need to do is just apply more pressure on Ukraine until Ukraine basically surrenders. If, on the other hand, Trump adopted a different strategy where you have some type of peace through strength, I think peace would be more likely because Putin will do the calculus and understand that he is going to lose a lot more from prolonging this war. While now there is really no penalty for him. Since Trump was inaugurated, there was only one sanction imposed on the Russian economy. And before that, we had, sanctions imposed basically on a daily basis. And this conversation that, we can have a peace deal in a week or in a month, it's delusional. It makes things more difficult. Plus, I don't think, Trump genuinely cares about Ukraine in any way. So it's obvious. He just wants to have a peaceful 30 seconds and then claim victory and, again, beg for a Nobel Prize in peace. And it's nonsensical. And, echo a little bit what George said earlier, that people in Europe, they feel very insecure now because you basically have a growing realization that you may be one-on-one with Russia. U.S. is not going to come and rescue. And in some ways, it gives me hope that even if U.S. drops out from negotiations of supporting Ukraine in any material way, there is a lot of commitment from European countries, from Germany, from Norway, from the UK, France, that they will defend Ukraine not only because they care about Ukraine, but also because they care about their own security. They know if Ukraine becomes a failed state, if it collapses, it will be a huge problem for them too. And so, in many ways, Ukraine is their first line of defense. So they are willing to commit huge resources. Just a few days ago, there was a meeting of ministers of defense, so-called Ramstein group, and they committed almost $40 billion in military aid for this calendar year. U.S. contributed zero. Many other countries contributed a lot of money. Germany contributed the most, something like $15 billion. And this is remarkable that a pacifist country like Germany is now the leading sponsor of military industrial complex in Germany, in Ukraine, and other European countries. So a very, very big change in how Europeans think about their security and how they view Ukraine as a sphere of Russian influence or as a part of Europe.
And Yuri, the question is about other European countries who are supporting. I've heard that Ireland has also done remarkable work. Is that anything that you can speak to? A
I
much
know
smaller country.
Ireland took a lot of Ukrainian refugees. I can't give you an exact number, but it would be, 100,000, 200,000, some big number for a small country as Ireland.
Mhm.
Ireland is a neutral country. It has a navy of maybe one military navy ship. I don't know how many, maybe two, three.
Mhm.
Nonetheless, it contributed to the fund dedicated to Ukraine's defense. I think, they can fund only non-lethal purchases. But, to the extent money is fungible, it doesn't really matter. So you can buy helmets with Irish money and tanks with German money. That's fine.
Mhm. And George, with Finland joining NATO, has there been any response to that?
Uh, I assume you mean on the part of Russia.
Right.
Yeah. Um, Nothing really consequential. I mean, there were when the Finnish prime minister spoke with Putin, Putin, contained his anger, but uh, and made some comments to suggest that Finland will come to regret this. But essentially, Putin and Moscow are just concentrated on Ukraine now and are uh, not taking action that would lead Finland or Sweden to believe they were under immediate threat. There have been, Putin already in the early 2010s defined his relationship with the West as a civilizational conflict. Um, by which he meant that the West, led by the United States, is ganged up against Russia and trying to capture Russia's sphere of influence in Ukraine, and Russia will not stand for that. Um, and after all, we have to remember that it was already back in 2014 that he seized Crimea and stoked civil war in the eastern provinces of Donbass. Um, but as a result of this notion of civilizational conflict, Russia has been touting internally a concept called hybrid warfare, which basically means we use all means at our disposal, though not necessarily nuclear weapons, but we use all means at our disposal to undermine the war effort that is being launched against us by these Western countries. That is how they would frame it, and that includes sabotage. That includes lots of things that would make people nervous. Far short of military invasion, we're talking about pinpricks that sting. Now, they may have been doing some pinpricks that sting vis-a-vis Finland. I don't know the details on that, but it would not surprise me.
Mm.
If I may add to this, the fact that there was no pushback from Russia in response to Finland and Sweden joining NATO. Um, George and I had this conversation 4 years ago. Was this about NATO, something like this? And to me, this was an ultimate proof that the Russian invasion of Ukraine was not about NATO. They have a lot more border now with NATO after Finland and Sweden joined the alliance. Um, I also wanted to say that, there was no civil war in eastern Ukraine. This was all Russian, occupation. Um, just, a factual observation.
Okay.
Among the members that are making comments are talking about the sort of parallel between when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, and just wondering, how is that similar enough? Do you think, Yuri?
In some ways, it's similar. It's a war of aggression then and now. What is different, however, and I was surprised that the losses in Afghanistan are a tiny fraction of what Russia lost in Ukraine, and I thought this is going to be, uh, the number of body bags going back to Russia is so big that there should have been a lot more opposition. And from this, I concluded that either the Russian population supports this war and they're okay with paying that price, or they're scared to death, to dissent. Either way, this is not a good outcome. You either live in a concentration camp and you become a totalitarian state, or you're just like a nation of crazies who wants to conquer another country and eradicate another nation. And so to me, this is a potential it's telling me again that this war can continue for a long time because if you have something like this, there is basically no pressure on Putin domestically to do anything. So we can have a war for another 4 years, 5 years, who knows how many years.
Mhm. And a member, Duncan, has put in that today apparently the president was asked, is there any progress in the Ukrainian negotiations? And he said, Russia wants to make a deal and Zelensky's going to have to get moving. Otherwise, he's going to miss a great opportunity. What what is in the deal from Russia? Is there any part of it that is
Russian demands have not changed from day one.
okay?
Denazification,
Yeah,
demilitarization, you give up, a lot of territorial, parts of Ukraine, you basically give up your sovereignty. It's not acceptable to Ukraine. And, Trump had deadlines, every day since he
right.
came to the White House. He may think there is progress. From the Ukrainian perspective, there is very little progress.
Yeah. And George, this leads me to ask, which is a sort of side question to all of this. What what does Putin have over Trump? Why I mean, I know this is a big question, but can you encapsulate? I mean, this is just bizarre.
Right. This gets us back to the intelligence agency's question.
Yeah.
I don't have any information that would that would confirm the notion that Putin has something over Trump. Uh, the speculation during his first term was that there might be something that goes when he accepted huge financial investments from the oligarchs. And then another piece of speculation was that when he was president of the Miss Universe contest in Moscow back in 2013, that they might have led him into sexual temptation and then filmed it, which would have also been something that would hold over him. But maybe the intelligence agencies know whether either of those is the case. But I could not verify it. That said, what Putin is at the moment trying to do, at this very moment is trying to do, is emphasize his maximalist demands on Ukraine
Hmm.
for settlement. The most recent was Lavrov, his foreign minister, saying a few days ago that there will be no security guarantees for Ukraine. Um, that's a pretty strong statement, considering that security guarantees could come from third world countries rather than from NATO countries. But he apparently, if it's a categorical rejection of security guarantees for Ukraine, it's um, probably categorically not acceptable, at least in their current posture. And so what we're seeing is they're continuously upping the ante, and they may be counting on Trump to abandon Ukraine in favor of prospective economic benefits, both for the United States and for his family, in the post-war era. If Russia could tempt Trump into that, because when you're sitting in Moscow observing the United States, you see the American president amassing for his family over $4 billion worth of side payments. Um, that's it's just unprecedented, and you see that international economic temptation is something that Trump loves to acquire. So uh, the maximalist demands from Moscow, the continuous upping of the ante, combined with this effort to tempt Trump into abandoning Ukraine with economic incentives, all point to me that uh, I probably agree here with Yuri, even if we don't necessarily agree on the origins of this war. Uh, that this could be going on for quite a while.
Mm. Is there is there any support for Ukraine in the Trump administration? I know among military leadership, do we know where they stand on things?
Okay.
I know, George.
I'm tempted to pass the baton to Michael Baker, but
Yeah, if there is support, it's very quiet.
yeah.
Uh-huh. Okay. Well, let's get to Michael Baker in just a moment. I want to ask one final question. There'll be a couple more questions that I'll return to from the member chat room. But how is the country, how are the country people assessing Zelensky's performance and his leadership? Are they still very much with him, despite the fact that, he has said, and I think people understand, this is not a time for elections. But Yuri, could you respond to that?
Yes, I think, he is safe politically. There is nothing that will undermine him in the current position. People are behind him. There is some disagreement about, specific policies, and some policies are not particularly popular. But there is a clear understanding that he is Ukraine's best chance at this point. People rally behind him. Maybe one indication of his support is that when Zelensky went to the White House to meet Trump, and there was a total fiasco for everybody, I think, the U.S. Policy for Ukraine, his support skyrocketed. Right. So people said, look, he may be not the best, president for some people, but they really understand that without Zelensky, it will be really hard to do things internationally or domestically. And just as an example, I don't know how he can do it. He travels a lot, and you mentioned earlier some enormous sums of money that were given to Ukraine to defend itself. It's hard to imagine who else could be so effective. And somebody asked Ronald Reagan when he was running for president how an actor can become president, and he said how a president cannot be an actor. And it feels like Zelensky is really into this,
Mhm.
mold. He is really great at communication.
Mm,
So in that sense, he is maybe surprisingly good leader for the country at this point.
mhm. Yeah.
Yeah, I would reinforce that by saying that in the course of this war, Zelensky comes across as downright Churchillian in the skill with which he has navigated the currents of this war and galvanized the Ukrainian people to fight back.
Great, thank you, both of you. Let's, if I could, I'd like to call upon Michael Baker, if we could spotlight and bring him in. Michael, hello there. I introduced you, that you would be coming in, and I think that there are two questions to start with. First is within the military leadership, is there any support for Ukraine? And then the second question will be, what are we learning about hybrid warfare? And you can take a piece of each of these, but
Okay.
we'll have you start with the first.
Okay. Well, I'm really honored that you asked me to be part of this with these three luminaries on your screen here. And I'm very grateful. Let me start with the military. I'm not on active duty, but I still know a few people. My impression is that they've gotten rid of pretty much everybody who might have had an opinion that they would express that didn't agree with Donald Trump. It's like the U.S. attorneys in Minneapolis. As soon as they say something independent, they're gone. So, we had the commander of SOUTCOM who probably did not want to blow up those little speedboats and kill people randomly, which is what we're doing. And he immediately had to retire. In fact, I think he was lucky he got to retire because we know how Trump goes after people. He arrests Don Lemon for, being a reporter. He, all crazy kinds of crazy things. So I don't think the military can stand up here. And in fact, I've given several talks on whether or not the U.S. military will fire on civilian demonstrators. ICE beat me to the punch, or I should say, Customs and Border Patrol fired on unarmed demonstrators. But your second question is hybrid warfare, and that is the future. It's very interesting because the war between Russia and Ukraine, to me, is an amalgam of World War I and Star Wars. And the reason I say that is we have heavy artillery, we have tanks, we have glide bombs, we have trenches, and at the same time we have drones patrolling the battlefield, not only to bomb, but to pick up casualties and move them back, unmanned vehicles moving casualties back. We're delivering food supplies, like I read about in the New York Times this morning. Pretty amazing. But the other parts of warfare that are hybrid that we don't pay much attention to have to do with things like space warfare, Starlink, putting the satellites out of business. If our satellites go out of business, we can't supply the Ukrainians with intelligence. And all that takes is a tactical nuclear detonation in the right place in space, believe it or not. So there's a lot of facets to this that, like I say, it kind of combines World War I with artillery and tanks and trenches, and Star Wars with space warfare, drones, unmanned vehicles, robots. We're going to see a lot more of that. And the ones that worry me the most, of course, are biologic weapons and things like that that can be unleashed on populations. And I feel about those a little bit the same way that I feel about nuclear weapons, which is that, our government faltered several times when Putin threatened to rattle the nuclear weapon cage, and we faltered. And I'd like to point out the fact that nuclear weapons, when detonated, the wind blows in multiple directions. And, just like in Chernobyl, you don't know which way the radiation is going to go, and it's going to go everywhere. So the use of that is hopefully unlikely, always possible, but I think we shouldn't have let them blackmail us a couple times when they got us to stop aid to Ukraine. But yeah, nuclear is another option, chemical, biological, unmanned vehicles, robots, space warfare. It's all on the table in the midst of what looks like a World War I battlefield. Back to you.
One
Oh,
thing I wanted to add, it
one more
doesn't
thing
have to
which I
be
can't resist.
wait, just a second.
I just wanted to say that it doesn't have to be a nuclear weapon. For example, Russians occupy the largest nuclear power plant in Europe, in Zaporizhia. That's a lot of nuclear material, and unthinkable things can happen there. We don't know what's happening there, how safe it is or how unsafe it is. When we think about nuclear threats, we shouldn't think about just about nuclear weapons. We have lots and lots of nuclear material in Ukraine that can be very dangerous, not just to Ukraine, but to Europe, other countries, other parts of the world. And also about, Star Wars, it feels more like Skynet, really. And it's inhumane in many ways when AI decides who to kill and who is going to live. But that's the future of warfare. Just today, there was a report from Wall Street Journal where they had military games between NATO forces and Ukrainians. And Ukrainians basically defeated NATO forces in one day because NATO is utterly unprepared for this modern warfare. People don't understand the role of the drones, how effective they can be, what are the weak points. And so this is what, makes me particularly nervous that if for some reason Ukraine is going to be under Russian control, Russia will have access not only to its own military industrial complex, it will have access to the Ukrainian military industrial complex. All the soldiers who are fighting now to defend Ukraine, they will be forced to fight for Russia. And we see this happen in eastern Ukraine. They drafted lots and lots of people from Donetsk, from Luhansk, and now they're fighting for Russia and dying for Russia, which is very sad. So, some people say, Russia is not going to be ready to attack, Latvia or Poland or whatever. But, Poland has an army of 200,000, soldiers. That's active military personnel. Ukraine has 900,000. Russia, 1.5 million. Europe does not have a fighting army. And we should understand that, maybe it's not a high probability event, but if you are worried about tail events like nuclear weapons and so on, biological warfare, then at that stage we should really worry about what happens if Ukraine becomes a part of Russia again. This is really dangerous.
George, do you have any thought about Russia's interest in the military complex in Ukraine? I mean, certainly we have heard, in our own media, just, what do I want to say, the acumen, that the Ukrainian military has shown around the use of drones and how effective they've been. Um, but this would be a consolidation of military force that would be surely a threat to Europe.
Well, this presupposes that Russia, in the end of this, is going to be able to conquer all of Ukraine. And I see that as uh, very, very unlikely. It's Ukraine is not going to be subjugated to Russia, analogous to Eastern Europe subjugated within the Warsaw Pact to the Soviet Union. Um, it's hard for me to imagine Russia willingly giving up, unless in the context of a succession crisis, uh, the eastern provinces. But it's equally hard for me to imagine the Russian military being in Lviv, in the western area of Ukraine. So I would assume they would have to genuinely conquer Ukraine, analogous to post-World War II conquering of Eastern Europe by Stalin, um, in order to integrate the entire Ukrainian military-industrial complex into the Russian military-industrial complex.
I agree this is a low probability event, but there are different ways to how you can subjugate Ukraine. Look at Georgia, right? You had a war, and now Georgia is basically run by people who align themselves with Russia.
Mhm.
So they're not interested in NATO anymore. They are not interested in European Union anymore. They help Russians evade sanctions. So something like this may be happening in Ukraine. If the peace deal or ceasefire isn't favorable, I can imagine there will be chaos politically, and then somebody who is going to promise peace with Putin is going to come to power and say, well, I give you this deal. We're going to have peace, but we'll have to have Russian military bases or whatever, and then gradually this is going to be integrated into the Russian war machine, and this can start another invasion. So I agree with you. It's a low probability event, but I don't think it's impossible.
Okay. I think, Yuri, another question for you that comes from the alley members. Still kind of amazed at the resilience of the Ukrainian people and this aggressive assault from Russia. And apparently they have blocked the grain production in Ukraine. Is that true? And what other kind of spots should we be concerned about?
In many ways, what happens in Ukraine is a miracle, but at the same level, it is a predictable miracle, right? So how Ukraine can survive? First of all, you have, determination of the people to fight, right? If you have will to fight, if you have high morale, you can take, losses and continue fighting. Then we see that there is a military solution to many problems. For example, we didn't have air defenses to protect our infrastructure before, so the Russians could destroy anything at will in any point of Ukraine. Now we have access to American Patriots, European anti-missile systems. So we're gradually building our defenses, and it allows us to protect our trade routes, shipping lanes. For example, early in the war, the Russian Navy could totally blockade the ports of Odessa and other ports in the Black Sea. Now Ukraine is shipping as much grain as it did before the war, more or less, same order of magnitude. It's true it is smaller, in part because the cost is higher, infrastructure is destroyed, But this military component is important for keeping the economy resilience going. We also see huge military and budgetary aid to Ukraine. Every year since the beginning of the war, the macroeconomic support to Ukraine was to the tune of $40 billion a year. That's a lot of money. We had about 40, $50 billion in military aid. It's not enough to bring Ukraine to parity in terms of military spending, not even close. We need to spend more money there. But, this is a huge injection of support. We see that, George was talking about the military economy. It's also happening in Ukraine. Every third hryvnia spent in Ukraine is basically spent on defense, 30%, right? It's a huge number. Uh, and so when you kind of put all of this together, all these forces, none of them maybe individually is big enough to stop the Russian assault. But if you keep adding, the determination to fight, you have resources domestically, you have reorientation of the economy towards defense, you have international aid, you have all these factors put together, and then maybe it's not surprising that Ukraine is holding up so well.
And Yuri, in the economic policy work that you're doing, is there even speculation about what it's going to take to rebuild Ukraine? Is that too early? One of our first questions that came in the chat was from Michael Myers, who was asking, can the 7 million people theoretically return? Will there be homes and will there be an economy and a life for them?
In life, I'm an optimist, and so I believe in bright future for Ukraine, and there are many, I think, reasons why it should be so. Ukraine is going to be a member of the European Union. It will have an investment boom, a reconstruction boom. The Europeans are committed to give a lot of resources to Ukraine. Recently, the European Union uh, gave basically a bridge loan of 90 billion euros to Ukraine for the next 2 years. In the next fiscal cycle, they commit $100 billion to Ukraine for reconstruction. That's a lot of money. Um, is this the right time to talk about reconstruction? I think it is the right time. Think about this in terms of the Marshall Plan after World War II in Europe. The D-Day in Europe was May 1945. The Marshall Plan arrived to Europe in 1948. It was 3 very painful years in Europe, and we had almost a collapse of those
Mhm.
countries politically, economically. We should learn from our mistakes, from our past experience. We don't have to wait 3 years in Ukraine to come up with a plan and kind of put everything in action. And I know there is very active work between the European Commission and the Ukrainian government on these plans. But frankly, it's very hard for the Ukrainian government to concentrate on reconstruction at this stage when you have to really focus on day-to-day things, like how do you deliver heating to people in Kyiv? How do you deliver food, here or there? How do you take care of, uh, destroyed power lines? So it's very hard to think about this long term, but I think there is some work being done now, and I think it's very important.
It is very. Thank you for that. I know um, figuring out how to help, um, as Americans, as Europeans. One of the films that we will be screening in our Global Lens course that will start on Tuesdays in April is a film called In the Rear View, and it was made by Poland's public television and by one of their filmmakers. In the Rear View, it takes place inside a Volkswagen van of transporting families from Ukraine into Poland. And it is such a remarkable and powerful statement of the shell shock that one encounters in being uprooted from one's family, from one's community, the all of that. I know that we need to keep telling the stories, that there's more narratives. Um, we would welcome knowing more. Yuri, if you hear of things that would be good for OLLI members to see, we've got a variety of avenues for screening things like that. I think it's also, I think we have mentioned in the past, and Michael, you might also have some ideas. You yourself have been boots on the ground in Ukraine. Are there, between you and Yuri, are there things that you might recommend uh, for people as ways to provide some support?
So, interesting question. Obviously, I think there's two things we can do to support Ukraine. One of which is to make appropriate donations to those charities that we think would be helpful, whether it's a humanitarian aid charity type like Rezom or Safe Skies, Tim Snyder's work on trying to get rid of some of the Russian attacks on Ukraine. But the other, I think, is, every morning, one of the things I do when I get up after I have my coffee is I get a couple of emails or letters out to somebody in Congress or in the Senate or whatever. And I remind them that even though we're all watching the insanity coming from the White House and our cabinet, it's really important to keep Ukraine in our view so that we keep supporting them. And I keep urging them to, double down on their support for Ukraine, even though this administration appears to be betraying them and selling them out. But, I think both contacting your representatives and getting some money into the pipeline if you have it. And then the third thing is, I think you have to talk to people. We're all here. Everybody here is real interested in this subject. But what about all my 50 neighbors who aren't online today? So if I get a chance to reach out to somebody, my kids crack up at the gym because I try to meet somebody new every day at the gym and talk to them. I don't always talk politics right off. I usually ease into it and get to know them first. But meet somebody new every day. Talk to them about what's going on. Tell them what you're worried about. Get them online to what we're dealing with. And like I said, we've got to do all three of those things. Very, very, very important.
Thank you. And please share the link. We will have a link for this talk today. Once we've been able to caption it, it will be posted to YouTube and perhaps a podcast from the university. In closing remarks, George and Yuri, please, whichever one of you wants to go first.
I'll go first. One can hope that Europe will be able to do without the United States for Ukraine sufficiently to make a big difference. I do worry, however, that Europe is not a stable actor here. If we get more right-wing governments come to power in European countries, they may not be as inclined to support Ukraine as the current governments have proven to be. Also, from the standpoint of changes in U.S. foreign policy, we can try to assist Ukraine through our individual donations as a people, but the big difference for the future of Ukraine, as opposed to the impact at the popular level of these donations, that's going to be determined by what policy is. Now, I think the Europeans were able to ride out the first term of Trump's presidency, and were relieved when Joe Biden won in 2020. But the fact that Trump has come back into power and has escalated his previous orientations toward disengagement, really, from the European theaters, suggests to me that any right-thinking or carefully thinking European leader now has to think long-term that they can no longer count on the credibility of American long-term commitments, because the MAGA phenomenon is not likely to go away, and Trumpism, even without Trump, may well come back to power at any time, whether in 28, 32, or 36. And so we have to think of a world in which sphere of influence mentalities are ascendant, and in Moscow, Beijing, and Washington, and in which our allies who might not wish to live in that kind of a world can no longer, even if an alternative American administration offers them good things, cannot count on that lasting, because they cannot count on the credibility of American long-term commitments. I think they've made that clear already in Europe, that's the way they're looking at the United States.
Thank you, George. Very sad statement. Yuri, and your closing remark?
Yes, I want to echo what and second what Michael and George said. It's very important to understand and be very clear-minded what we can do as individuals and what we can do as the country, as the government, with the policy. And obviously, the big money, the big resources are from the government, not from individuals. And so we have to exercise all our tools to pressure lawmakers and other politicians to kind of stay focused on Ukraine. I also agree with George that, isolationism in this global world is a terrible policy. We know when U.S. kind of stayed away from Europe, we had two world wars coming from that. And then in the end, American soldiers died on the European soil. We want to avoid this kind of situation. So in many ways, what I think what I want to have as a takeaway message from this is that we at least I care about people in Ukraine a lot for many humanitarian reasons and so on. But we should also understand that the hard calculus here is that it is in the best interest of every American to make sure that Ukraine defeats Russian aggression. It's not because of charity or anything like this. It is in the best interest, economically, politically, to make sure that we live in a safe world. We can trade. We are not living in a fragmented world. It's going to be to the benefit of everybody.
Yuri, thank you. And I think along the same vein, we must also talk about the midterm elections and how important those will be in trying to achieve some further balance around the executive branch. Let me thank everybody for today. We will be having an intergenerational dialogue next week on the Supreme Court and the whole question around the division between church and state. You can tell there's no end to the things that we can talk about. And then the last Friday in February, February 27th, Marianne Nessel, who is a world authority on food policy, food systems, the corporate takeover of food systems in America, will be in conversation with Marian Standish, who served for a decade or two at the California Endowment and was a main person around food policy, both the research and the implementation. So we hope to see you then, and obviously hope to see you not only in the winter classrooms, but the spring classrooms will be equally exciting and trying to keep our focus on what the main issues of the day are and how we can continue to thrive as we go forward. Thank you again, everyone, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.